Have you ever felt the precise second your world cracked, not from a tragedy you expected, but from a cruelty you never imagined someone you loved could deliver? I still remember the sting before the heat, the shock before the pain, the silence before the scream that never left my throat. It happened in the smallest of domestic moments, the kind of moment where you're supposed to feel safe, seasoning a pot of soup in a kitchen you believe belongs to family. Yet as I leaned over the simmering broth, carefully adding just enough salt the way Robert used to like it when he was young enough to eat with delight instead of distraction, Dawn's shadow fell over me like a storm. Her steps were sharp, impatient, and then suddenly the ladle was in her hand instead of mine. I didn't have time to step back. I didn't even have time to flinch. What I felt first wasn't the hot metal. It was the shock of being struck by someone who had never even tried to know me. The ladle crashed against the side of my head, and my balance wavered as boiling droplets rolled down my temple. Before I could even process the burn, her voice, cold, loud, dripping with contempt, cut through the air, a cruel reminder that in this house I wasn't family. I was an inconvenience. And as I pressed my hand against the throbbing spot where she hit me, I realized something even more painful. Robert heard everything. He was sitting just a few feet away, the living room open to the kitchen, the television murmuring. I waited just 1 second, 2 seconds, three, for him to turn toward me to ask what happened, to defend me the way sons are supposed to defend their mothers. Instead, I heard the remote click. The volume rose. He didn't want to hear me. He didn't want to see me. A sting of betrayal far deeper than any ladle burn rippled through me. That was the exact moment something inside me loosened, like a knot coming undone after decades of being pulled too tight. But the unraveling didn't begin today. It had been building quietly, softly, since the day I lost Henry. My life before that had been a steady rhythm of love and routine and small joys, his laughter in the backyard, our Sunday morning dances in the kitchen, the comfort of knowing that even in hardship we had each other. When he collapsed among the flowers he loved so much, my life tipped into a silence so immense it swallowed me whole. I thought moving in with Robert and Dawn would lift some of that silence, fill it with family warmth, heal the raw edges left behind. Instead, I found myself shrinking, folding myself into corners, making myself useful so I wouldn't be a burden, cooking breakfast at dawn, scrubbing floors before sunrise, ironing shirts that weren't mine, tiptoeing through someone else's house like a guest overstaying her welcome. And every day, Dawn made sure I knew the truth. This wasn't my home. She didn't have to say the words, they dripped from her tone, from the way she corrected me, from the sighs she exhaled when I entered a room, from the way she only ever used my first name like I was a stranger borrowing time. But even then, even as the cracks spread slowly, I held onto one fragile belief. Robert would never let her cross the line. He would protect me, or at least respect me. Yet here I was, soup dripping onto the stovetop, my head pulsing where the ladle had struck, and the man I raised with my own hands had turned the television louder so he wouldn't have to deal with the discomfort of his mother being hurt. Isn't it strange how a lifetime of love can be undone by a single second of silence? As I steadied myself, Dawn's glare bore into me, waiting for me to apologize for her violence, as if my existence was the actual offense. And somewhere beneath the pain and humiliation, a thought flickered, a dangerous one, a thought I had never allowed myself to have. What if I stopped trying to earn love that was no longer there? What if this moment wasn't proof of my weakness, but the spark of something else? I didn't yet know what that was. I didn't yet understand the depth of what lay ahead, or the secret that would soon rise from the ashes of my broken dignity. But as I touched the tender bruise forming beneath my fingertips, a strange calm settled over me. Not acceptance, not surrender, something colder, something sharper, something that whispered, "This is the moment everything changes." And even though I didn't know how, or when, or what would come next, I could feel it, the shift, the crack in the foundation, the beginning of a story I never expected to live. A story Dawn and Robert would regret ever triggering. Because the truth was already moving toward me, quietly, patiently waiting to reveal itself in the most extraordinary of ways. But neither of them had any idea that the woman they dismissed today carried a secret powerful enough to turn their entire world upside down. I think the moment my son told me, with rehearsed calmness, that it's better if you find somewhere else, was the moment I finally understood how swiftly love can be redefined by convenience. But the truth is, the night I became invisible didn't begin with his words. It began months earlier, on the day I packed my 4 suitcases and left the home Henry and I built with our bare hands, believing I was moving toward safety. I had told myself Robert's voice on the phone, the worry, the insistence, the mention of danger at my age was proof of his love. But now I see it clearly. Maybe he was just fulfilling a duty he resented, offering hospitality for the sake of appearance rather than affection. I walked into their pristine house carrying memories they had no space for. And from the very first moment, Dawn's cold smile told me everything I refused to admit. She greeted me like a polite stranger, not a mother-in-law who had loved her son with every fiber of her being. Even the guest room she prepared felt temporary, as if she were reminding me not to get too comfortable. The window faced a dark alley, the sheets were mismatched, and the only empty shelf was the one already coated with dust. But I placed Henry's photographs on the wall anyway, hoping his smile might make the room feel warmer. It didn't. My days began long before anyone else woke. I brewed coffee, cracked eggs, squeezed oranges the way Henry loved, and every morning I waited for something: gratitude, a smile, acknowledgement. But instead, Robert mumbled thanks without raising his eyes from his phone, and Dawn always seemed offended that breakfast wasn't prepared exactly the way she imagined. The coffee was too weak, the eggs too dry, the toast too dark. The simplest tasks became tests I always failed, and slowly, without realizing it, I shrank into the smallest version of myself. Don't be a burden, Helen. Don't ask for help, don't take up space. Isn't it strange how quickly we adapt to disrespect when we're afraid of losing the people we love? Every day I cleaned corners no one noticed, tidied messes no one acknowledged, picked up crumbs of a household that pretended I wasn't there. I moved like a ghost, quiet, efficient, invisible. Dawn worked from home, but somehow I was always in her way, always wrong, always the problem she needed to correct. And Robert, distracted by his own life, allowed every insult to pass as if silence were the safest choice. But silence is a choice, and his silence hurt more than Dawn's cruelty. There were nights I lay awake listening to the tick of the hallway clock, trying to pinpoint the moment I had lost my place in my own son's heart. But there was no moment. Love doesn't shatter, it erodes. Slowly, quietly. Until one day you realize you're standing in rubble. The afternoon of the ladle strike wasn't the beginning of my downfall, it was merely the moment the pretending ended. When Dawn stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me shaking, burnt, and ashamed, I expected desperately for Robert to come check on me. Comfort me, rescue me, but the living room remained unchanged. The television stayed loud. The laughter track of whatever show he was watching spilled into the kitchen like mockery. Isn't it terrifying when the person you love most becomes a stranger in front of your eyes? 5 minutes after Dawn's explosion, I heard Robert walking toward the kitchen. For a moment, I felt hope bubbling, painful, foolish hope. But he entered the room with disappointment etched on his face, as if I were the problem, as if I had invited the chaos. His first words weren't, "Are you okay?" or "What happened?" They were, "Mom, what did you do?" And that was the exact second I knew I didn't belong here anymore. Later that night, as I sat alone in the small guest room, staring at Henry's photographs while packing the same suitcases I had unpacked months earlier, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not heartbreak, not yet, something colder. Something like acceptance. When the taxi horn honked the next morning, Robert was waiting at the door, offering me $200 without meeting my eyes. I took it without speaking. What was there left to say? Even the goodbye felt transactional, like he was letting go of an obligation, not a person. The cab door shut, and with it, the last remnants of belonging snapped like brittle twigs. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, but because I didn't want to remember the sight of my son standing in the doorway of a home that had no room for me. It's strange how quiet the world feels when you realize no one is waiting for you anywhere. The motel the driver took me to smelled of damp carpet and old cigarettes. The bed creaked when I sat, the air felt heavy, and for the first time in months I let myself cry freely, loudly, painfully, without hiding the sound. Every tear was a memory leaving my body. Every sob was a truth I refused to see finally becoming real. But even in that grief, something unexpected stirred, a small, fragile spark. A whisper inside me saying, "This is not where your story ends, not yet." I didn't know it then, but life was already shifting in ways I couldn't imagine. Because the woman they abandoned tonight would soon discover a secret powerful enough to make their cruelty look insignificant. Have you ever wondered what breaks first? The body from hunger or the heart from realizing no one is coming to save you? When I stepped out of the motel with my 4 suitcases dragging behind me like anchors tied to memories I didn't want anymore, the sun felt harsher than usual, the pavement hotter, the world louder. I had never imagined that at 71, the sentence, "Where do I go now?" would hang over my life like a storm cloud. Isn't it strange how quickly the world becomes unfamiliar the moment you no longer have an address? My money evaporated faster than pride. I lasted barely a week in that dim motel room where I spent my evenings sipping vending machine coffee and staring at the stained ceiling, wondering how a life could collapse so quietly. When the receptionist knocked on my door and told me I needed to pay or leave, his voice wasn't cruel, it was the indifference that broke me. Indifference always cuts deeper than anger. I begged for one more night, just one, but he repeated the same line every institution uses when the world has no room for you. Sorry, those are the rules. So I left, dragging my suitcases with blistered hands, my back aching, my throat dry from hours of walking without a destination. I wandered through blocks of concrete and shadows, searching for somewhere that didn't feel hostile. Eventually, I reached a park in downtown Los Angeles, a place where people pretended not to see the suffering around them. I sat on a metal bench that burned against my skin, but I didn't move. I watched children running, pigeons pecking at crumbs, joggers passing with wireless headphones, and no awareness of the woman sitting among her luggage, trying not to cry. A little girl stared at me curious, but her mother tugged her away quickly as if homelessness might spread like a virus. And in that subtle gesture, I felt myself become something less than a person, an inconvenience, an eyesore, a statistic. That first night, I didn't sleep. I clutched my purse to my chest like a shield, flinching at every distant siren. Other homeless people settled into their spots, cardboard beds, blankets thin as paper, faces etched with stories too painful to speak. One man approached me, his clothes dirty but his eyes surprisingly gentle. He offered me a piece of stale bread. Eat, Grandma, he said. Nights hit harder when your stomach's empty. I took the bread with trembling hands because hunger is stronger than pride, and his kindness felt more human than anything I had received from my own family in months. Isn't it odd how strangers can show you more compassion than your own blood? Morning came cold and merciless. My clothes reeked of sweat and asphalt, my hair stuck to my scalp, my stomach growled like an animal inside me. That day I learned something about survival no one teaches you. Shame disappears the moment hunger arrives. I found myself walking behind restaurants, checking dumpsters, scanning for anything edible. At first, I felt disgusted with myself. But when you're starving, dignity becomes a luxury. I found half-eaten sandwiches, bruised fruit, stale bread, food others had abandoned without a second thought. And every time I lifted something from those trash bins, a little part of me whispered, "How did your life come to this? How did love turn into this?" Twice a week, a nearby church served soup. I joined the line of people with eyes sunken from exhaustion and stomachs empty from days of hardship. A young volunteer smiled at me every time she handed me a bowl. "God bless you," she would say. It made the food taste sweeter but also made my heart ache. Because kindness felt suspiciously like a memory of the life I once had. The life where Henry and I sat at our kitchen table eating meals cooked with laughter instead of survival. Nights were a different torture. The cold seeped into my bones, the darkness amplified every sound, the fear grew thicker. I wrapped my sweater around me, but it wasn't enough. I listened to the whispers of the city, the rustle of stray animals, the moans of the wind, the occasional murmurs of other homeless souls who spoke to themselves to stay sane. I stared at the sky and wondered if Henry could see me. Would he have imagined I'd end up here? Would he have forgiven me for not being strong enough to walk away sooner from a home that didn't want me? Days blurred. Hunger became routine. Loneliness became familiar. I walked with my suitcases everywhere because they were all I had left of a life that once belonged to me. People stared, some with pity, others with disgust. One afternoon, a police officer woke me with a flashlight. "You can't sleep here." "Move along." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. He gave me an address of a shelter, but when I got there, they told me it was full. "Come back early tomorrow." Always tomorrow, never today. Isn't it strange how easily society expects you to wait for help, yet never waits for you? At some point, I don't know which day it was, I stopped counting. My reflection in a store window startled me. Tangled gray hair, smudged cheeks, hollow eyes, clothes wrinkled and stained. I didn't look like a person anymore. I looked like a shadow wearing a woman's shape. And yet somewhere in that shadow, something still flickered, a stubborn pulse of defiance, a tiny voice whispering, "You may have lost everything, but you're still alive." And then one afternoon, as I sifted through my suitcase looking for a clean shirt, a yellowed envelope slipped out, one I didn't remember packing. My heart stuttered, Henry's handwriting. His familiar loops, his name on the corner, my breath hitched. Inside that envelope was something waiting for me, something he left behind. Something that would take the woman sitting on a park bench and transform her life in a way no one, least of all Dawn and Robert, could ever have predicted. Because inside that forgotten envelope was the secret that would turn my suffering into power and their comfort into fear. Have you ever opened something so small, a letter, an envelope, a folded corner of paper, and felt your entire identity tilt as if the universe had been waiting for that exact second to reveal its real plan for you? When that yellowed envelope fell out of my suitcase and onto the dusty park bench, it didn't look powerful. It looked fragile, almost accidental, like something forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. But as soon as I recognized Henry's handwriting, the soft loops, the steady slant, the unmistakable tenderness in the way he wrote my name, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, the noise of the world faded. The cars rushing past, the distant chatter of strangers, the throb of the city. It was just me, my trembling hands, and the quiet voice of a man who had loved me for 50 years speaking through a piece of paper. Isn't it strange how someone who is gone can still reach out with more care than the people who claim to love you today? I opened the envelope slowly, almost afraid to break whatever spell it carried, and there it was. A letter dated 2 years ago, written when Henry had been hospitalized with pneumonia. I remember that time clearly. I had hovered over him, wiping sweat from his forehead, insisting he would recover, refusing to let him see how scared I was. I didn't know then that he had written this. I didn't know he had been preparing something far bigger than a goodbye. As I read the first lines, my tears blurred the ink. If you are reading this, Helen, it means I'm no longer beside you. Forgive me for leaving you alone in a world that has not always treated you as gently as you deserved. My fingers tightened on the paper. Even in death, Henry understood me better than the people breathing under the same roof I once slept in. The letter continued, revealing truths I never suspected, secrets he had kept not out of deception but love. He wrote about the investments he made quietly over decades, the properties he bought when they were worthless, the buildings he renovated, the accounts he opened and nurtured like seedlings. He wrote about wanting to surprise me one day, wanting to give me security so solid I would never have to depend on anyone else, not even our son. My eyes widened as I unfolded the documents inside: property deeds, investment summaries, rental contracts, account balances. 13 properties, 13. An entire portfolio built brick by brick while I worried whether we had enough savings for retirement. My heart raced. I read numbers I had never imagined in my entire life, accounts with more zeros than I knew how to count, assets worth millions, a financial empire built quietly by a man who had cooked breakfast beside me and danced with me barefoot on our kitchen tiles. But one detail hit me hardest: Magnolia Street, apartment building number 452. My breath stopped. That was Robert's building. The same building where Dawn had struck me, where Robert had ignored me, where they had thrown me out like an unwanted guest. And the building was mine. It had been mine the entire time. Isn't it unbelievable how the world can flip, how the powerless can discover they were never powerless, how the ones who belittled you were living inside your generosity? I sat there on the bench with those papers scattered across my lap like pieces of a new identity, feeling disbelief, grief, rage, gratitude, and something sharper, all twisting into a force I didn't yet have a name for. And then, at the end of the letter, Henry had written one final instruction: contact lawyer Roger Mendes. He has the originals and has been waiting for you. Trust him the way you trusted me. And Helen, my love, don't let anyone make you feel small. You are stronger than you know. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and stood up, feeling something shift inside me. I walked to the nearest payphone, clutching the letter like a lifeline. When the law firm answered and I gave my name, the receptionist gasped softly. "Mrs. Salazar, we've been trying to reach you for months. Please stay where you are. We're sending a car immediately." I hung up with trembling fingers, a car coming for me, a woman who had dug through garbage cans for scraps, a woman who had slept on park benches. A woman who had been struck, belittled, discarded, yet somehow was the unseen owner of the world Robert and Dawn believed belonged to them. 30 minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside the park. People stared at me, this disheveled, exhausted woman being escorted into a luxury car by a driver who opened the door with the same dignity he would offer to royalty. As I sank into the leather seat, my body still aching from nights spent cold and hungry, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not comfort, not relief. Power, quiet, dormant, but unmistakable power. And it terrified me as much as it electrified me. When the elevator doors opened onto the 15th floor of the law firm, the receptionist looked at me with wide eyes, not judgment, but surprise, like she couldn't reconcile my appearance with the file she had in front of her. I understood. I didn't look like a woman worth millions. I looked like a woman who had been forgotten. But the thing about forgotten women is that when they rise with force. When I stepped into Attorney Mendy's office, he stood up immediately. "Mrs. Salazar," he said gently, "I'm so sorry you've been through this, but you're safe now, and there is much you need to know." For the first time in weeks, I felt my spine straighten. I wasn't homeless anymore. I wasn't powerless. And I definitely wasn't invisible. I was the legal owner of everything that had kept my son and his wife comfortable for years, and they had no idea. But they were about to learn. because the woman they threw away had just inherited the power to turn their entire world upside down. Have you ever looked in the mirror and realized the version of yourself staring back is someone you've never met, but always secretly hoped to become? In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened. I began shedding the version of myself that had walked into Robert's house like a grieving widow desperate for belonging, and I started becoming someone entirely different, someone I didn't know I was capable of being. When Mr. Mendes laid out Henry's empire, 13 properties, hundreds of tenants, millions in investments, I felt the ground beneath me shift, not with fear, but with a strange, growing certainty. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, the world felt like it was waiting for my decisions rather than handing me its own. Isn't it astonishing how quickly a person can go from being ignored to holding the strings that make others dance? Yet, even with the documents spread across the lawyer's polished wooden table, even with the truth laid out in numbers too large for my tired mind to process, there was still a part of me that felt undeserving, unsure, small. That old version of Helen, the careful homemaker, the quiet mother, the woman who apologized before speaking, kept trying to whisper her way back into my thoughts. But every time she did, I remembered the ladle on my temple, the taxi pulling away, the cold metal bench beneath me, and the silence of my son choosing convenience over his own mother's dignity. Those memories acted like scissors, cutting me free from the timid woman I used to be. And with every passing hour, I felt something sharper take root inside me, clarity. Mr. Mendes began explaining the legal structure Henry had envisioned. The accounts were mine, the properties were mine, the decisions mine. But I knew immediately I didn't want the world to see Helen in these documents. Helen had been dismissed, underestimated, walked over. I needed a name that carried weight, authority, mystery, something no one could link back to the woman Dawn had insulted in her kitchen. So when Mr. Mendes asked what name I wished to use for my new legal entity, the answer came to me with surprising certainty. Mendoza Enterprises, I said, and I felt a thrill run through me. Mendoza was my mother's maiden name, a woman as fierce and composed as the mountains her ancestors came from. I would borrow her strength now. From that moment forward, I didn't walk through life as Helen. I stepped into my decisions as Mrs. Mendoza, and that identity fit me like armor. Mr. Mendes arranged everything with swift efficiency, and soon all 13 properties were officially under the management of Mendoza Enterprises. The building where Robert and Dawn lived, the one they believed was simply theirs by luck, became the first file I studied. The rent they paid was laughably low, a charity Henry had extended out of love, and I couldn't ignore the irony. The home they had weaponized against me existed only because of Henry's generosity toward his son, but generosity without gratitude becomes entitlement, and entitlement must always be corrected. Isn't it remarkable how easily people confuse privilege with ownership? When I instructed Mr. Mendes to raise all rents to proper market value, including Robert's, he looked at me cautiously, as if expecting hesitation. But there was none. It wasn't revenge, it was restoration. If they were going to live in a space I owned, they would live in it under the same rules as everyone else. No favors, no discounts, no exceptions. Fairness isn't cruelty, it's balance. And balance was overdue, but my transformation didn't end at paperwork. Over the next 2 weeks, I rebuilt myself from the outside in. I walked into a salon carrying the exhaustion of months, but walked out looking 10 years younger, not because vanity suddenly mattered, but because presentation is power. I cut my hair to a clean, modern length. I covered the gray with a warm, confident brown. I let a makeup artist teach me subtle colors that highlighted my eyes and softened the years of grief etched into my face. Isn't it strange how a simple haircut can remove the weight of someone else's judgment? Then came the clothes. For decades, my wardrobe had been built around practicality. Gray dresses, faded cardigans, soft shoes meant for standing long hours in kitchens. But Mrs. Mendoza needed something sharper, something that said, I know what I own. So I chose tailored pantsuits, elegant blouses, structured coats, clothes that didn't try to hide me. Clothes that made space for my presence rather than shrinking it. Every morning, I woke in the hotel's quiet luxury and sat at the desk with financial reports spread before me. Mr. Mendes explained income streams, rental cycles, tax liabilities, maintenance schedules, and tenant histories. And much to his surprise and my own, I absorbed it all quickly. Perhaps because after decades of managing households, children, and a husband through life's storms, managing properties felt like a larger, more strategic version of the same care. For the first time in my life, I exercised my mind in a way I never had, and it felt like discovering a muscle I didn't know I possessed. With each passing day, I became more certain that Henry had known exactly what he was doing. He had built an empire not just to secure my future, but to ensure that when the moment came for me to rise, I would have every tool available. He had trusted me with a world I never thought I could hold. And now I was learning how to hold it well. Raising Robert's rent was only the first ripple. As Mendoza Enterprises, I reviewed every tenant, every contract, every arrangement. I corrected outdated leases, rebalanced prices, and ensured the business finally ran the way Henry intended. Some tenants protested, others adapted, but Robert and Dawn. They were about to feel the first tremor of the earthquake they had unknowingly set into motion. Because while I was becoming someone new, their world was beginning to crack, slowly, quietly, inevitably. But the tremor they felt was nothing compared to the shock waiting for them when the woman they discarded returned, not as Helen, but as the owner they never knew existed. Isn't it unsettling how fast a comfortable life can crumble when even one silent pillar holding it up finally moves? While I was learning to stand taller as Mrs. Mendoza, Robert and Dawn were living their ordinary days, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already begun to shift. They woke up in the same polished apartment, brewed their expensive coffees, scrolled through their phones, and complained about bills they never fully paid attention to, all while assuming the universe would continue gifting them comfort without consequence. Isn't it strange how people who benefit from generosity often forget it wasn't earned? For years, they had lived in that apartment at a fraction of its market value, convinced their ease of living was normal, deserved, and guaranteed. But entitlement always has an expiration date, and theirs had arrived. The rent increase notice went out with dozens of others, clean, professional paperwork issued by Mendoza Enterprises. No signature that hinted at me. No handwriting Dawn could recognize. Just a crisp, impersonal document stating that the era of favors was over. It required a new rent of $2,500 effective in 30 days. For most tenants, the adjustment was manageable, even expected. But for Robert and Dawn, whose lifestyle was built on stretching every dollar beyond its limit for the sake of appearance, the increase might as well have been a tidal wave. Mr. Mendes kept me informed. "They've called 3 times this morning," he said the day after notices went out. "Your daughter-in-law is expressive." I imagined Dawn pacing their living room, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the marble countertop, her voice rising in disbelief that the world dared inconvenience her. And Robert, my son who once cried over scraped knees, now trapped in a marriage where image came before stability, likely stood beside her nodding, apologizing, stressing, but doing nothing useful. The mental picture wasn't satisfying. It was sobering because I wasn't watching strangers struggle. I was watching the consequences of choices they had made long before the rent changed. Still, the dominoes began falling. Their first reaction wasn't adjustment, it was denial. Dawn insisted the notice was a mistake. Robert left frantic voicemails for building management. They demanded to speak to the owner. They argued they had a special contract. They insisted they were owed something. Isn't it incredible how quickly people cling to exceptions when fairness finally enters the room? But Mendoza Enterprises didn't make exceptions. Not anymore. Meanwhile, I continued my transformation peacefully, learning, growing, finding strength in every new decision. But every update on Robert's situation tugged at something inside me, something old, raw, motherly. When Mendes informed me they attempted to apply for a loan to cover the increase, my heart twisted. Not from pity, but from memory. I remembered helping Robert fill out his first school forms, teaching him to save coins in a jar, guiding him through college applications. Now he was a grown man drowning in debt, married to a woman who thought spending was a sport, desperately applying for loans because he couldn't afford rent in a building he didn't even know belonged to his mother. But the loan application didn't get far. Their credit was already strained. Dawn's spending habits had quietly created cracks in the foundation of their life, cracks Robert ignored because it was easier than confronting a woman who treated every disagreement like betrayal. Their finances weren't just unstable, they were sinking. Then came the second blow. One of Dawn's primary consulting clients, located in a property that ironically I also owned, received its rent adjustment. They reviewed their expenses, trimmed unnecessary contracts, and Dawn's consulting gig was among the first to go. Mendes delivered the news casually, unaware of the emotional storm it would ignite in my son's household. But I knew. I could imagine Dawn's reaction. The blame, the fury, the accusations toward Robert for not earning more, the refusal to consider her own habits. And I could imagine Robert shrinking, apologizing, regretting, but never truly confronting her. Isn't it fascinating how a single hidden truth can ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one can predict? Their arguments escalated. The private investigator I hired reported shouting behind closed doors, slammed doors echoing down the hallway, neighbors whispering about tension in apartment 301. Dawn blamed Robert for everything: her lost contract, their rising bills, their inability to keep up appearances. And Robert blamed himself because that's what he had learned to do. I wasn't witnessing cruelty now, I was witnessing collapse. The next rent cycle came, and unsurprisingly, no payment arrived. Mendes called me. "They're late," he said simply. Late meant consequences, and consequences meant the first formal eviction notice. When the notice was delivered, Dawn reportedly tore it in half before even reading the full text. Robert tried reasoning with management, asked for extensions, begged for meetings, but Mendoza Enterprises did not negotiate with entitlement. And yet every update stirred complicated feelings inside me. This wasn't revenge, though Dawn would have called it that. This wasn't punishment, though Robert might have felt it. This was accountability. This was the universe returning everything to balance, and balance, unfortunately, is rarely gentle. The following month arrived, and again, payment didn't. That was the final threshold. Mendes asked me for confirmation before filing eviction proceedings. My hand didn't shake when I said yes, but my heart did tremble in a quiet, unfamiliar way, because saying yes wasn't difficult. Living with what yes meant, that carried weight, and so began the legal unraveling of my son's life. The debt collectors, the bank notices, the mounting tension between two people who had never truly built anything real together. While I signed documents in quiet hotel rooms filled with fresh flowers and soft light, Robert was losing sleep, losing footing, losing grip. The contrast was painful, ironic, poetic, and undeniably fair. Because the truth was simple, they had pushed me to rock bottom without blinking. Now life was pushing them toward their own, and I was no longer the woman who softened consequences. But the collapse they were experiencing was nothing compared to the reckoning that awaited in the courtroom, where they would unknowingly stand before the owner they had thrown away. Have you ever sat in a room full of strangers and watched your past walk in, unaware you now hold its future in your hands? The morning of the eviction hearing arrived with a sky the color of unspoken truths, gray, heavy, waiting to break. I woke with a strange stillness inside me, the kind that comes when a person knows she's standing at the edge of something irreversible. As I dressed, smoothing the dark gray pantsuit over my shoulders, tying my hair back with calm precision, it struck me how far I had traveled from the woman who once measured her worth by how quietly she could move through someone else's house. Now every choice felt deliberate. Every breath felt like a reclaiming. And stepping into that courtroom wasn't just about legal proceedings. It was about witnessing the universe shift its weight, finally pressing consequences into the lives of those who had never imagined they would face them. Isn't it strange how justice doesn't shout? It arrives quietly, disguised as paperwork, deadlines, and the clack of a judge's gavel. I arrived early and took a seat at the very back, blending into the crowd of tenants, landlords, attorneys, and restless people waiting for their names to be called. No one paid attention to me, and that anonymity felt like a cloak I wore intentionally. The Helen who had once been treated like an inconvenience was invisible out of force. The Helen sitting here now was invisible by choice. And that difference tasted like power. The wooden bench beneath me was cold, the air smelled faintly of old books and disinfectant, and somewhere nearby, someone whispered nervously to their lawyer. I didn't look toward the door, I didn't need to, I felt them before I saw them. Robert entered first, and seeing him again after months of distance and silence struck me harder than I expected. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. His shoulders slumped, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his expression heavy with embarrassment and fear. The man who once turned up the television to drown out my pain now walked like someone being crushed by the weight of his own choices. And despite everything, a maternal instinct flickered faint but still alive. Isn't it cruel how a mother's heart keeps loving even when it has been bruised beyond recognition? Dawn walked beside him, not defeated but furious. Her dress too elegant for a courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her jaw tight. She didn't look at Robert, she only looked around, searching for someone to blame. Entitlement wore her face like a mask cracked in the center. Their lawyer trailed behind them, riffling through papers, already appearing overwhelmed. They sat near the front, completely unaware that the woman who once cooked their meals was sitting just a few feet behind them, watching with a steady, unreadable gaze. The judge entered, a woman with stern eyes and an expression carved by years of hearing excuses. The murmurs died instantly. Case after case passed, each punctuated by quiet arguments and brief rulings. And then, case number 3478, Mendoza Enterprises versus Robert Salazar. My breath didn't hitch, my heartbeat didn't stutter, I was steady. coldly, quietly steady. Their lawyer rose first, launching into a flustered explanation about sudden increases, unfair adjustments, and special agreements with the previous owner. His voice trembled slightly, betraying how unprepared he was to defend privilege masquerading as grievance. Dawn shook her head dramatically, whispering angrily into Robert's ear. Robert simply stared at the floor, then Mendes stood. And watching him speak on my behalf, calm, collected, organized, was like watching a sculptor carve truth from stone. He presented every document with precision. The original contract, the legally permissible notice, the missed payments, the grace period already given, the delinquency that followed. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts laid bare. The judge scanned the paperwork with unwavering focus. Mr. Salazar, she finally said, her tone neither cruel nor comforting, just truthful. Is it correct that you owe 2 months' rent under the adjusted terms? Robert rose stiffly. Yes, Your Honor, he murmured, but the change was sudden and she cut him off gently but firmly. 30 days' notice is the legal requirement. You were given that time. A pause. Do you have the owed amount today? The courtroom held its breath. Robert looked at Dawn. Dawn glared at him. He looked at his lawyer. Then finally he whispered, No, Your Honor. In that moment, something inside me settled, not joy. Not triumph, something quieter, like a wound finally scabbing over, because the truth was simple. This wasn't cruelty. This wasn't vengeance. This was the moment when the consequences they had evaded for years finally arrived at their door. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff, the judge declared. You have 10 days to vacate the premises. Failure to comply will result in forced eviction. Next case. And just like that, their world cracked. Dawn exploded, throwing words at the judge like sharp stones, words dripping with disbelief and entitlement. The judge ignored her. Their lawyer tugged at her arm. Robert didn't move. He just stood there, absorbing the blow in silence. They walked out without ever seeing me. They passed inches from where I sat, broken pride, broken confidence, broken illusions trailing behind them like shadows. And I watched them go with a heart neither bitter nor triumphant, just resolute. Because this wasn't the end, it was simply the unveiling. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Mendes met me at a nearby cafe, already prepared with updates and files, but before he spoke, he studied my face. How do you feel? He asked. How did I feel? I considered the question carefully. Watching my son fall wasn't victory, watching justice arrive wasn't satisfaction. What I felt was something in between, an acceptance of how things had unfolded and a quiet understanding that the path forward wasn't revenge, it was revelation. And that revelation hadn't even begun. Because Robert thought he had just faced the worst, yet he had no idea that the owner he sought to confront next was the mother he had thrown into the streets. What would you do if the person you were about to beg for mercy turned out to be the very person whose suffering you once ignored? The request for a meeting came through Mendes 2 days after the courtroom ruling, and though I had been expecting it, hearing the words aloud still sent a quiet tremor through me. Your son wants to speak to the owner, Mendes said, watching me carefully, as if trying to read whether this would reopen wounds or forge something new. But wounds don't reopen when the skin has already hardened into something stronger. Instead, I simply nodded, the decision forming with calm precision. I would meet him, but not as Helen, not as the woman he once dismissed, not as the mother he abandoned, not as the quiet presence in the corner of his home. I would meet him as Mrs. Mendoza, the woman who now held the power he had taken for granted. Isn't it strange how life sometimes brings you face to face with your own past, but only after giving you the strength to confront it? The next afternoon, I sat behind Mendy's polished desk, not because I wanted to intimidate Robert, but because it was the only space where the balance of power finally made sense. The office felt cool and still, the hum of the city floating faintly through the glass windows. I wore a charcoal pantsuit, elegant, structured, unmistakably intentional. My hair was neatly tucked back, my glasses rested on the bridge of my nose, and the calmness in my chest felt almost surreal. A few months ago, this same son had watched me bleed on his kitchen floor and turned up the television to silence my pain. And now, he was coming to plead for help from a stranger, never suspecting that stranger was the very woman he had cast aside. The universe has a poetic way of arranging reckonings. When the door opened and Robert stepped inside, the shock on his face didn't hit instantly, it unfolded slowly, like a drawing being revealed line by line. First confusion. Then disbelief, then a kind of horror that carved deep into his features. He stopped walking, his mouth parted slightly, his eyes widened as though grief and recognition were colliding inside him. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking with the ghost of a boy I once knew. And for a moment, something inside me softened, but not enough to undo what needed to be done. Sit down, I said calmly, my tone cool and even, not cruel. Not warm, simply controlled. He lowered himself into the chair opposite me as if his legs had forgotten how to hold him. His gaze darted around the room, desperate for an explanation that made sense. I don't, why are you here? Why are you dressed like this? What is this office? Mom, what is happening? His voice trembled, and I could see the moment he realized the world he thought he understood was rearranging itself completely. I'm here, I said, folding my hands, because I am the owner you requested to meet. His brow furrowed. His confusion deepened, and then like a puzzle snapping into place, the truth struck him. Mendoza, he murmured. Mom, Mendoza is you? I didn't flinch. Yes, I am Mendoza Enterprises. The room fell silent. Time seemed to stop breathing. Robert stared at me as if trying to reconcile the mother he had thrown away with the woman sitting before him now, a woman of posture, of clarity, of authority. I watched him examine me, his eyes flicking over every unfamiliar detail, the tailored suit, the polished hair, the steady gaze. He wasn't just seeing me, he was seeing everything he had failed to see before. Isn't it painful how people sometimes only recognize your worth when it's wrapped in power instead of love? Then he broke. His face crumpled, his shoulders shook, his hands covered his eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry, he choked out, the words tumbling between sobs. I didn't know you were suffering like that. I didn't know you had nowhere to go. Dawn told me to give you space. She said you were just upset, and I believed her. I wasn't thinking, I wasn't. He couldn't finish. I let him speak. Let him unravel. Let him finally confront the truth he had avoided for months. But when he paused, gasping softly, looking at me with pleading eyes, I asked the question that had lived inside me like a bruise. Tell me the truth, Robert. Are you sorry because you hurt me or because you lost the comfort you thought you'd always have? He froze, the silence between us thickened, and then in a voice barely audible, he whispered, I don't know. And that was the most honest thing he had said in years. Dawn had trained him to ignore anything that challenged her narrative. He had allowed convenience to outweigh conscience. He had chosen ease over integrity, and now he was paying the price. I leaned back, studying the man my son had become. You had a mother who cooked for you, cleaned for you, loved you, and you let your wife treat her like a burden. You turned up the television while I cried in the kitchen. You watched me pack my life into suitcases and didn't follow me out the door. You let me disappear and you never called, not once. He shook his head violently. I was wrong, I was weak. Dawn controlled everything, our money, our decisions, our fights. She said you were dramatic, that you exaggerated, that confronting her would ruin our marriage. And I believed her because I didn't want to lose her. But I lost you instead. His voice cracked again. For the first time in the entire conversation, I felt something shift, not forgiveness, not closure, but understanding. He wasn't excusing himself, he was exposing himself. I exhaled slowly. You're not being evicted because I'm cruel, you're being evicted because that's how the world works when you live irresponsibly. I'm treating you the same way I treat every tenant, no better. No worse, he nodded, wiping his eyes. I deserve that. He didn't ask for favors, he didn't ask for money, he simply sat there, shattered, finally aware of the weight of his actions. But he still didn't know the hardest truth, because the path I was about to offer him next wasn't punishment, it was a chance to rebuild himself from the ashes of his own choices. How do you know when justice has finally been served? And when you're crossing the invisible line into something darker, something that starts to look like revenge? As Robert sat across from me in Mendy's office, eyes red, shoulders trembling, I felt something shift inside me, something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't entirely prepared for. I had imagined this moment many times during those long nights on park benches, when the cold seeped into my bones and the hunger gnawed at my stomach. I had imagined feeling triumphant, vindicated, powerful. But now, staring at my son crumbling under the weight of his own choices, the feeling wasn't triumph. It was something far more complicated. Isn't it strange how the heart can hold anger and love at the same time, like two flames burning in opposite directions but somehow inside the same lantern? He wiped his face with shaking hands, unable to look at me. I don't know who I am anymore, Mom, he whispered. I don't know how I became this person. And for a moment, I didn't speak. I wanted to measure my words, not for his sake, but for mine, because whatever I said next would define the future, not just for him, but for me. When someone hurts you so deeply, it's easy to convince yourself that the world owes you justice. But at what point does justice become a cage you trap yourself in? I remembered the park bench, the stale bread, the freezing nights, the shame of digging through garbage cans because pride couldn't fill an empty stomach. I remembered Dawn's cruelty, Robert's silence, the way he turned up the TV when I cried. I remembered packing my bags alone, walking into a cab while he watched from the doorway like I was a guest overstaying her welcome. Those memories were real, searing, unforgettable. But as I looked at him now, broken, humbled, desperate, the sharp edges inside me softened just enough to allow another truth to emerge. Accountability and compassion could coexist. They didn't cancel each other, they defined each other. I leaned forward and spoke softly but firmly. Robert, consequences are not cruelty. What's happening to you isn't punishment, it's reality. A reality you avoided for too long. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. I know, he said, but I want to fix things. I want to be better. I don't know how. There was no defensiveness in his voice now, no excuses, no blame directed toward Dawn or anyone else. It was the first time I'd heard him take responsibility, not as a cornered man, but as someone genuinely awakening to the truth of his own life. I studied him carefully, letting silence stretch just long enough for clarity. You can rebuild, I said, but rebuilding doesn't happen through comfort, it happens through discomfort, through facing what you avoided for years. He looked at me with the eyes of the boy who once held my hand crossing the street, the boy who cried when he broke his toy truck, the boy who hugged me tightly after nightmares. How does that boy grow into a man who ignores his mother's cries for help? Life doesn't turn people cruel overnight. It wears them down, tempts them with convenience, blinds them with ego. I took a slow breath. You need boundaries, I continued. Structure, responsibility, stability that comes from within, not from someone cushioning your fall. He nodded again, almost eagerly, as if clinging to any guidance I offered. I can do that, he whispered. Just tell me where to start. That was the moment I realized something essential. I didn't want my son to drown. I just needed him to learn how to swim, and swimming requires struggle, not rescue. Not comfort, not shortcuts. I wasn't going to give him the apartment. I wasn't going to cancel his debt. I wasn't going to reverse the eviction. What I was going to offer was the one thing Don had stripped from his life: structure, a plan. A path forward that depended entirely on him. You'll start, I said carefully, by finding a smaller place you can afford, something realistic, something humble. He blinked, absorbing the truth. And after that, I continued, you will get a job that pays the bills, not a job that impresses anyone. He exhaled shakily. Okay, he said, what about Dawn? The question hung heavy between us. Dawn, the catalyst, the spark, the poison that slowly seeped into his decisions. That, I said, is for you to decide, but understand this: anyone who demands you betray yourself or your family to keep them happy is not a partner. They're a prison. His face twisted with pain, the truth hitting with an honesty he couldn't avoid. He nodded again. I continued, and Robert, if you ever want a relationship with me again, it must be built on respect, not guilt. On responsibility, not dependency, on honesty, not silence. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I want that, he whispered. I really want that. For the first time since entering the room, tears gathered in my eyes, not from sadness, not from pity, but from the realization that maybe, just maybe, something inside him had finally cracked open to let the light in. The mother in me, buried under layers of hurt and betrayal, felt a pulse of hope. Not a naive hope, a cautious one, hope with boundaries. And just when I thought the moment couldn't grow heavier, Mendy stepped in with a file and said, Mrs. Mendoza, we need your signature. And there it was, the reminder of who I'd become. The reminder that this wasn't just an emotional reunion. This was business, this was reality, this was transformation. As I signed the papers, Robert watched me with something new in his eyes, not fear, not entitlement, but respect. For the first time in our relationship, he saw me not as a background character in his life, but as a person with power, agency, and purpose. But even as he tried to rebuild, neither of us knew that my next decision, one rooted not in revenge, but in clarity, would change both our lives forever in a way even he didn't expect. What if losing everything you thought defined you was the only way to finally meet the woman you were always meant to become? In the weeks that followed my meeting with Robert, life unfolded with a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in years. A calm not born from comfort, but from clarity. I watched from a distance as my son began the slow, humbling climb toward rebuilding himself, not with shortcuts or excuses, but with a raw honesty that had been absent in him for years. He moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment across town, a place far smaller and less polished than the one he had lost, but something about it suited him, maybe because, for the first time, it reflected reality instead of pretense. Isn't it fascinating how authenticity, even when it appears small, feels more spacious than luxury built on lies? He found a steady job, nothing glamorous, nothing that fit Don's standards, but something he earned with his own effort. And in that effort, something shifted inside him. The constant panic I had seen in his eyes for years began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. When he spoke to me, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, he didn't ask for bailouts or sympathy. He asked for guidance, for conversation, for the chance to rebuild what he had cracked. And slowly, with caution and boundaries, I let him. But while Robert was learning how to rebuild, Dawn was choosing destruction. She refused to move into the modest apartment. She refused to adjust her lifestyle. She refused to acknowledge her role in their unraveling. Instead, she blamed him for everything: his mother, the eviction, her lost contract, her dwindling bank account. Isn't it strange how some people fight harder to protect their illusions than to repair their reality? Eventually, she left, slamming the door not just on their relationship, but on the fragile identity she had crafted through borrowed status. Robert didn't chase her, he didn't beg. He just watched the door close and whispered, "Maybe this is the first honest moment we've had." Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I never expected. As Mrs. Mendoza, I stepped into a world that had always existed silently around me but had never felt accessible. I met with contractors, negotiated maintenance orders, reviewed financial reports with confidence, and made decisions that affected hundreds of tenants. My days were full, structured, alive. And somewhere in that rhythm, I realized something profound. All the years I spent shrinking myself in someone else's home had nothing to do with ability. They were about belief, the belief that a woman's worth shrinks with age, that grief makes you fragile, that motherhood demands silence. But pain doesn't make you weaker. Pain introduces you to your power. The strangest part was how natural it all felt. I didn't feel like an imposter in my own success. I felt like a woman reclaiming a throne she never knew she had. Even Henry, in his quiet wisdom, had seen this version of me long before I did. Perhaps that's why he built everything in my name, not to leave me wealth, but to leave me space to grow into myself. One afternoon, I visited one of the buildings to meet a tenant named Martha, an elderly woman who had been struggling but always paid what she could. Her kindness reminded me of who I once was, but unlike me, she didn't have a hidden empire waiting to rescue her. When she greeted me, apologizing for the delay in her payment with trembling hands, something soft and fierce rose inside me. I waived her late fees and arranged a manageable plan for her future. She cried in gratitude. And in that moment, I realized something essential. Power doesn't erase compassion, it shapes it. Weeks passed. Robert visited me every Sunday, not out of obligation, but out of sincerity. We sat in my hotel lounge, sipping tea, talking about work, life, regrets, hopes. He spoke openly for the first time about his marriage, about the pressure he felt to keep Dawn happy, about how he lost himself in the process. And I listened not as a victim seeking apology, but as a mother who finally understood that healing required truth, not punishment. One afternoon, while we sat together, he asked softly, "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I looked at him, really looked, and answered honestly. No, because if they had, I wouldn't have met the woman I am today. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth with the humility of someone who finally understood the difference between guilt and accountability. But the moment that cemented our new beginning came unexpectedly. As he was leaving one evening, he paused at the door, turned back, and said, "Mom, thank you for not saving me. I think I needed to fall to finally see who I am." Those words, simple, quiet, sincere, felt like the final stitch in a wound that had taken too long to heal. And as I stood there watching him step into the hallway of the hotel I now lived in by choice, not necessity, I felt something inside me settle in a way it never had before. He had grown, I had grown. And for the first time in a long time, our paths were not crossing at a place of pain, but at a place of respect. In the quiet of that night, as city lights shimmered against my windows, I realized the truth that tied every moment of this journey together. Revenge had never been my victory, power had never been the final goal. What I gained wasn't wealth or status or even justice, it was my voice. The voice I had silenced for too long, the voice I had allowed others to drown. The voice that now spoke clearly, firmly, confidently. I was not the woman they struck in a kitchen. I was not the woman abandoned at a motel. I was not the woman who dug through trash cans to survive. I was the woman who rose. The woman who rebuilt, the woman who remembered her worth. Because in the end, the quietest people often carry the loudest secret, and sometimes that secret is simply discovering who they truly are.